August 1998, Tulsa, Oklahoma. 24-year-old Daniel Whitaker walked out of a bar after a night with friends and was never seen again. Hours later, his truck was gone, his bank account untouched, and his watch, cracked and frozen at 11:58, was found in a drainage ditch miles away. Years later, a grainy VHS tape surfaced, showing a shadowy figure leading Daniel toward a car, and what looks like a body being shoved into the back seat before the headlights vanish into the night. Who was that man in the cap? Why did Daniel disappear without a trace? And why, decades later, are anonymous letters still arriving, claiming to know where his body is buried? This is the chilling, unsolved case of Daniel Whitaker, a mystery that refuses to stay in the dark. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe for more unsolved cold cases and chilling mysteries. The last thing anyone remembers with the certainty of a photograph is the flash of Daniel Whitaker's grin beneath the neon of the Blue Lantern. It's frozen in the minds of the town's few who saw him that night. A crooked, easy smile that made everything seem like nothing would ever go wrong. He raised a glass, laughed at a joke no one else could remember, and stepped out into a humid Tulsa August that smelled of exhaust and river water. After that, the town carved a missing person notice into the calendar and left the rest to rumor. Daniel was 24, a forklift operator at the railroad yard by day, the kind of man who liked his shirts worn thin at the collar, his beer cold, and his blue truck loud enough to get him in trouble with neighbors who woke to an idling engine. He had a way of sitting at the end of bar stools like he belonged to the room. Hands open, shoulders loose, opinions ready, but cautious. He also carried his little brother's hockey practice schedule on a thumbtack note at home and a pair of socks with holes that his mother had laughed at for years and never thrown out. He was ordinary in a way that made his disappearance shatter belief like glass. Tulsa in 1998 had the slow hum of a town used to the ordinary breaking. A new mall, a new sheriff learning how to wrestle budget meetings, families that had seen more funerals than parades. Daniel's parents, May and Howard, had a kitchen table the color of coffee stains and the sort of patience that had been practiced into a religion. When Daniel didn't come home that night, their patience became a search party that refused to quit. The official report is short. Last seen leaving the Blue Lantern at 11:42 p.m., wearing a black leather jacket, jeans, and scuff boots, driving a blue 1989 Ford Ranger with a dent on the left fender. Witnesses reported he'd been with friends, laughter, cigarettes, a loud exchange about baseball, but nothing that indicated a fight. He was sober enough to perk up at the sight of someone he knew. He promised to be back in an hour. He never came back. In the early days, the town loved to fill in the blanks. A quasi-heroic story said he'd gone off with a woman he'd met that night and ran toward a mysterious new life in Denver. Another, crueler, suggested he'd been taken for reasons no one wanted to stitch into a sentence: debt, mistaken identity, or a feud with someone who had a reputation for answering slights with violence. They planted candles at the entrance to the Blue Lantern. They chalked messages on sidewalks, and they printed his face as though it would catch him, like a net. The police did what they could. Sheriff Collins, a broad man with an old comb-over and the slow, deliberate speech of someone used to thinking twice, organized searches. He interviewed Daniel's friends until they became raw from telling the same stories night after night. They checked hospitals, drunk tanks, and the county morgue. They pulled bank records. No withdrawals beyond Daniel's paychecks. They scoured phone logs and traced the trucks and high school acquaintances. For 6 months, hope expanded and then deflated like a slow lung. 2 years later, when interest had cooled and people were trying to return to the rhythms of their lives, a girl found Daniel's watch in a drainage culvert behind an abandoned gas station out near Riverside Drive. It was the kind of place where teenagers dared each other to spray paint and smoke, and where the river whispered secrets when the wind was right. The watch was bent, cracked, the face slashed as if someone had tried to pry the hands free. The sheriff's office issued a terse bulletin and then sat on the evidence. The watch belonged to Daniel, but there was no body, no DNA, no prints that could hold a man's fate in place. That watch became the centerpiece of 1,000 conversations. It was evidence enough to keep the family awake, and evidence not enough to make the town sleep. May kept a copy of the news clipping on the fridge for years, as if proximity to the paper would conjure returned footsteps. Howard took to working longer hours at the warehouse. Daniel's younger sister, Lila, locked herself in an attitude that was part grief and part rage. They were living the contingency of not knowing, which is its own kind of grief that multiplies each day. Something remains unsaid. The months bled into years. People who'd once written notes on the linoleum moved away. The sheriff retired, replaced by a younger man who promised to reopen cold cases if given the staff. The Whitakers attended press conferences that yielded templates of counsel and civic sympathy. Their pleas matured into a steadier kind of demand. They brought out photographs on anniversaries, squared them up against the lens like a wound. But it was the other things, the small, stubborn discoveries that made the case stick at the edges of Tulsa's memory. A taxi driver remembered picking up a man matching Daniel's description at around 1 a.m. near 36th Street. He'd been talking to himself, the driver said in a hushed way, and his hands had been shaking. A woman who cleaned the Blue Lantern's women's restroom found a cigarette lighter in the trash that had the initials DW carved into it, and she saved it in the apology drawer of her purse until the police came. A landscaper found a smear on a rock near a trail. Looked like blood, he told the sheriff over coffee the next morning. But then he shrugged. He did not know blood. These were the breadcrumbs, the tiny false leads that keep families hoping. The sheriff's office would catalog them and then bury them under the more expensive things: forensic reports, canine searches, officers' overtime. The Whitakers learned to keep their grief like an old radio, tuning in when they needed company. Lila, who had once been the kind of child who asked questions about everything, became the one who asked the most dangerous question. Why Daniel? Why him and not another? Her question dug in the county like a root. She started volunteering with the investigative group that handled cold cases, determined to keep the hunt alive with a conviction that made people nervous. They let her in because she had nothing to lose. It was Lila who brought new life to the case 6 years later when she found a reel of old VHS tapes at a yard sale 3 towns over. They were labeled with dates and bar nights, and the handwriting on the box was the same slant as the notes Daniel used to leave on the table. She brought them home, hooked a battered VCR to her television, and pressed play because the Whitaker family had become that thing, desperate enough to pull truth from tacky plastic. The footage was grainy, the colors washed by time. It showed the Blue Lantern exactly as they remembered. Smoke curling under neon, jukebox half-lit, men clapping each other on the back. Daniel appears in earlier frames, alive in the way that makes your lungs remember breath. He dances badly with a girl in a floral dress, and then leans against the bar to trade jokes with a man who laughs like thunder. It is a private life captured in cheap film stock, and the way Daniel moves on camera seems to irritate the absence he has become. At a 47-minute mark, the tape shows something else. A car idling in the Blue Lantern's parking lot, headlights bright against the summer dark. A man with a cap gets out, walks toward the front door, and then out of the frame, and in his place, a shadow moves too fast to parse. On the next frame, Daniel is out by the curb, his face directed toward the shadow, his hands raised in a way that looks more pleading than threatening. He walks backward, then turns and moves off-screen. The camera catches the tail end, a flash of boots, a car door slamming, then a figure lifting what looked like a limp shape and placing it gently into the back seat before the headlights fade. Lila handed the tape to Sheriff Barton with a hand that trembled. Barton, new to his role and hungry to make a mark, put on his gloves and replayed the footage until the screen went blue. His team ran forensic enhancement, tried to isolate audio, and tugged at the frame with technical patience until it stretched thin. There was no clear face. There was nothing that could be used in court. Yet the tape was the clearest storytelling device anyone had seen in years. It said what every missing person case wants to say: something happened. There were so many explanations. An organized crime element, some argued. The city had its share of dirt under the carpet. A random act of violence, suggested others, carried out by a stranger who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Whitakers clung to the simplest hope, a mistake, like a man being taken and hidden away, alive somewhere with no one to believe a story. The sheriff felt the pressure and launched a new inquiry that would last for months, and then years, chasing the image of a shadow. The investigation widened. They found a man, broken now by time, who once worked at a towing company on the night of Daniel's disappearance. He remembered a blue truck and a call that came in late from a man who wanted a car moved from the lot behind the Blue Lantern. He remembered building a story in his head to explain why someone would have a parked car there at that hour. His memory was a rope with frayed ends. He could not swear. He said he'd seen a man with a cap, the hood pulled low, who had a cigarette between his fingers and moved like he had somewhere to be. The sheriff's team believed it enough to follow the lead. They found an alley where the towing man said a blanket had been folded over what looked like a box. It was a small, lead like a match flame, easily smothered. On the third year of reinvestigation, a lawyer from Tulsa contacted the Whitakers with a name: Dean Harlow, a local real estate developer with a string of polite businesses and a civic overlay that gleamed under the sun. He had donated to the community theater, hosted charity galas, and kept photographs with state senators in his office. The lawyer said Dean had a reputation for closing deals and, according to a whisper that had made its way through the grapevine, for not tolerating those who threatened his projects. People who worked with him described his temper like an old rumor, sharp and private. The thought that Dean could be involved attracted attention like a magnet to iron filings. There's an old mechanics rule that says problems present themselves in patterns, and Dean's pattern was that of someone who could tie up loose ends at scale. He owned property near the Riverside Drive, and his construction crews had been in the neighborhood around the time Daniel disappeared. When Sheriff Barton attempted to question him, his legal team smoothed the conversation into silence. Dean never raised his voice in public, but his lawyers did it for him. Then, on a damp afternoon, an anonymous envelope arrived at the sheriff's station. Inside was a Polaroid of Daniel standing in front of a building that was being remodeled, one with Dean's logo stenciled on the scaffolding. The back of the photo had a single line scrawled in red ink: "Look closer." Barton felt the hair on his arms lift. It was a kind of provocation that meant someone wanted his attention. He brought the photo to the Whitakers, who, for a moment, let hope in like a guest and held it like a talisman. The investigation into Dean never reached a charge. The Polaroid was admissible as evidence of proximity, nothing more. Dean's alibi held against the strict gaze of court standards. His crew backed up his story. Barton found himself up against the kind of power that had just enough money and influence to smear a net around suspicion until it frayed. The case became a public story about how the scales of justice sometimes tilt. Years later, Dean's businesses still thrived, but his name carried a rumor like a stain. People began to measure their fears against what they'd seen: a man with a cap at the Blue Lantern, a truck gone into the night, a watch found in a culvert. They recycled the story in bars and at PTA meetings until it felt like a native part of Tulsa's landscape. The Whitakers kept the missing posters on their refrigerator and in frames in their living room. They celebrated the birthdays they could remember with a half chair at the table where Daniel used to sit. Then Lila got a call that made the world briefly tilt with possibility. A woman in a town 3 hours away called to say she'd seen a man who looked like Daniel at a flea market. The woman described his laugh, his walk, things that feel reliable to someone who watches faces like a map. Lila drove there the same week, heart thumping like a stranger in her chest. The man was there like a suggestion, browsing through lamps. Lila watched him from across the aisle, her palms slick. He turned and met her gaze. For a moment, everything in her leaned forward as if the world could tilt into a single point. It was not Daniel. The man was an echo. He carried Daniel's posture and nothing else. Lila sat down on a plastic chair and let the air go out of her. For the Whitakers, every near miss was its own kind of cruelty, a rehearsal of reunion that never arrived. They learned to forgive the town for wanting to believe, but not the feeling of being emptied out by hope. Time, however, sharpened certain things. As the case aged, patterns that had been missed began to appear. A reporter from Tulsa's paper dug into early calls to the Blue Lantern and found that the night Daniel disappeared, there had been a second, unreported incident at 1:12 a.m., A call from a woman terrified about a man following her to her car, saying he had been watching from the dark, but she had left before officers arrived. She'd been described as hysterical. The notes were thin. The detail that made the reporter sit up was that the woman's description of the man's jacket matched the one Daniel had been wearing. That detail knitted itself into other small things: the watch in the culvert, the Polaroid with Dean's logo, the man in the cap moving like he had somewhere to be. The town began connecting dots like constellations, bending old rumor into new theories. Lila felt the case like a living thing again, a wounded animal that might be coaxed into light if handled delicately. She took to the streets with a camera that summer, retracing Daniel's last known steps. She walked the route from the Blue Lantern to the parking lot, peered into the shadows of the alleys, and peered into the ache where memory blurs. On one of those walks, she found a faded sticker on a lamppost. It was for a towing company that had long since closed. The sticker had been same as the name the tow driver had mentioned years ago. Lila pushed the sticker with her thumb until the edge lifted like a promise. She learned to talk to people who wouldn't have spoken before. Old men at gas stations, women who worked late shifts and saw things people didn't notice. They offered her scraps, a pair of boots thrown in a dumpster, a truck seen idling on the night in question. She compiled them like a catalog. She had no badge. Her authority was insistence. On a May morning, 3 lifetimes out from the night Daniel went missing, Lila got a call from a woman in her 40s who said, without preamble, "I drove the man you've been looking for." Lila's knees went soft. The caller said she had been 19 at the time and had been drinking at the Blue Lantern when a man had offered to walk her to her car. He'd seemed kind, the woman said. He'd seemed like someone worried about her. He'd asked to keep walking, and when she hesitated, he pressed on. She told Lila the man had stopped at a vacant lot, and here the woman's voice changed. He had handed her a camera he'd found and asked her to take a picture of the sky. She laughed then, embarrassed, and said she had taken it because it seemed like a good thing to do, to remember stars. What she handed Lila was a photograph, grainy, colors bled by years, but a photograph nonetheless. It showed a pair of boots near a car, and in the distance, a building with a scaffold that bore the faint outline of Dean Harlow's logo. The woman swore the man had climbed into a car in the film's edge and was gone. But the picture didn't show the man's face. It showed a scene, an impression. It verified a possibility, and it kept the case linked to someone with power. Lila took the photograph to Barton, who had grown older and more skeptical with every fresh lead. He filed it and called in favors. They subpoenaed construction logs, employee lists, any paper that might hold the silhouette of a man. Dean denied any involvement. His lawyers filed motions. The case grew teeth and then grew tired of gnawing. What the Whitakers discovered was not a neat narrative. Reality is messy. Truth is not always a linear thing. The clues pushed and pulled, suggesting that Daniel had been the wrong man at the wrong time, in the wrong place for choices that were not his. Maybe he'd been mistaken for someone else. Maybe he'd run into a private violence that wasn't meant for him. What was certain was that someone saw fit to remove him from the clear light and keep him from coming home. There are nights when Lila sits on the edge of her brother's bed, the mattress sunk in where he used to sleep, and reads aloud from letters he'd written before he went out that last night. She talks to him as if speech was a bridge wide enough to span years, angry, pleading, tender. She dreams of the last moments recorded on the VHS and construes the shadow's movement into 1,000 possible ends, and then tears each one to pieces to see if any hold. She does this because to be human is to refuse the simplest conclusion, that the world could swallow a life and offer no explanation. The town never stopped talking. The Blue Lantern closed eventually. Its neon sign was sold on eBay for a tidy sum. New bars replaced it, and the stories that grew there had edges that the old ones did not. People used Daniel's disappearance as an anecdote for caution, a way to mentor their children against late nights and bad choices. The Whitakers aged in a different kind of way. They were kept young by the absence of their son. They were forced into a permanence of waiting that made them ancient before their time. And then, like the slow shift of tectonic memory, something else arrived. The case was reopened by a cold case unit with resources the sheriff's office could only dream of. They analyzed the tape again, this time with technology that turned the grain into a more revealing set of pixels. Patterns that had once been invisible began to suggest movement. The angle of the cap, the way a jacket folded at the shoulder, a tattoo on a wrist that had been obscured by shadow in every previous review. The enhancements were not a revelation, but they were a refinement. They added grit to the outline of a man. A name emerged from the edges, Carl Knuckles Morrow, a man whose nickname had been earned in older, rougher fights. He worked as a driver for a series of companies and did odd jobs on the side when the city's construction boom required extra hands. He had been around for a while, a man like a shadow that could be mistaken for other things. He had a militant set of friends and an uncanny way of being in places that later became relevant. The detectives found Carl living quietly on the edge of town. He had a home with a lawn that was too long and a dog that barked in a sleep shout. He had a record for assault and a way to make his voice small when asked about the night in question. He denied seeing Daniel, but witnesses recalled him in the area. He had been known to drive for towing companies when he needed cash, and he had been seen with a man in a cap on multiple occasions. They built a case around circumstantial evidence. His proximity, his past violence, his friendships with men who had jobs that could provide the muscle for a disappearance. The evidence was not ironclad, but then such evidence rarely is. The detectives chased it with the low, persistent energy of people who have decided not to let coldness do the closing. One morning, the sheriff's team went to Carl's house with a warrant and dredged through his personal effects. They found a box of shirts, a yellowed receipt from a gas station near Riverside Drive, and a set of keys that didn't match any car they could identify. They found photographs of Dean Harlow cutting ribbons, patterned with Carl's thumbprints on the back. Carl denied everything and clung to a silence that was thick and practiced. They pulled a search of his truck and found nothing. The case, once again, strained at the limits of what could be proven. Prosecution, they learned, was a hungry beast that ate only what could be given to it without doubt. In court, doubt is a law and a language. The district attorney looked at the file and asked the question the Whitakers had been asking themselves for years. Do we have something that will stand? The DA wanted DNA, a body, a confession. He wanted proof without shadow. He wanted the kind of truth that could be boxed and titled and signed. They didn't have it. Carl was arraigned for obstruction and for an unrelated assault that had solid witnesses. He was indicted on those, given a sentence that would put him behind bars for a handful of years. But the charge that the Whitakers wanted, that would call the name of the man who had taken their son, did not come. Courtrooms are not for moral clarity. They are for legal certainty, and the law bowed to its own rules. Carl's arrest felt like movement, like the first flinch in a long-stalled engine, but it did not deliver Daniel. The case became one of the million small injustices that keep families alive. The Whitakers walked in the middle distance of public sympathy now and then. People left flowers at the river on anniversaries. But there was no closure, unless you count the closure of ritual. A funeral service held with an empty casket, a life acknowledged, and then sealed with flowers. Closure is a word we teach ourselves to mean something kinder than the whole we carry. Years later, Lila found herself standing at the edge of the river at dusk, watching the water carry leaves like silent tributes. She had married a man who listened enough, and she had a son who kicked in a stroller like a deaf drummer. She told the child stories about an uncle he would never meet, a man who loved the sound of engines and hid toast in his pockets for practice. She made these stories not as evidence, but as a way to keep part of Daniel in the warm light. One evening, an envelope arrived in her mailbox with no return address. Inside a single page, typewritten and brief, we buried him near the old mill. It was not a confession. It was not a map. It was arranged like a joke, cruel and concise. Lila clutched the paper until the edges whitened. She ran to the sheriff. They searched the mill, an old place with rusted girders and an ankle-deep lake formed in its foundation, and they found disturbed soil, as if something had been placed and then covered in a way to be hidden from time. It could have been anything. It could have been the bones of another animal, a pile of trash, or the worst. They dug with machine and hand, and the earth gave back root, a bottle, a bone fragment that could have been from a deer. They sent it to the lab. The results came back months later. Inconclusive. Not human. The letters continued to arrive, typed, unsent. Each one was a stone in the path that led nowhere. People asked, why would someone do this? Why bait a family with hope? The simple answer was that some people enjoy being a lever in another's life, the power of making someone look up and believe. The crueler answer was that someone wanted the case to be reopened, to be worked on again, so that it became messy for the law. There are reasons people nudge stories loose. There are reasons others keep them tucked away. The motives were as many as the ghosts in Tulsa. If you measure the story of Daniel Whitaker by what is knowable, a watch in a culvert, a VHS tape with a shadow, a Polaroid, a few photographs, a man named Carl with a record, you get a skeleton of a tragedy. If you measure it by what it did to the people who loved him, you get a different organism entirely. Grief is not a thing to be proven. It is a weather system that shapes landscapes. The Whitakers became people who carried weight for the rest of their lives. They learned to make peace with a lack of finality. There are nights when Lila dreams she hears Daniel's truck pulling up in the dark. The engine hums, then dies. She waits with a flashlight, thinking she will see him step out, hair mussed, apologetic about something small. But she wakes to empty floors and the fan's slow spin. She keeps his watch on a shelf now, polished to a shine, its hands frozen at 11:58. It is a little liar of memory, always stopping at the time that makes the story feel half begun. The town of Tulsa grew and forgot with a diligence reserved for small tragedies. New bars opened, new scandals took the news cycle, and the Blue Lantern became a nostalgic mention in articles about the town's past. The Whitakers aged like a photograph in a wallet, edges curling but image intact. They learned to live with a notch in their lives where Daniel wasn't. And yet the case refuses to be contained by polite memory. It remains one of those files people pull from the drawer when they want to remember what it is to be unsettled. Young detectives study it to learn about the limits of evidence. Mothers tell their children about Daniel to warn them about the night. Lila keeps writing to anybody who will listen, sending the VHS tape to cold case units, emailing journalists, making the case a thing of public conscience. There's a last scene that keeps returning to those who love Daniel. The Blue Lantern's neon flickers in a storm, the parking lot slick with rain, a man in a cap lifting another body into a back seat with a tenderness that is its own terror. The camera lingers on Daniel's watch lying on the pavement, its face cracked, its hand stopped. An engine starts, and the truck moves off into the rain, tail lights blurring into a small, red line that disappears into the dark. That image is what the town carries. It is not an answer. It is a photograph for the memory, a promise without fulfillment. The Whitakers have learned to live with it, because grief yields to living rather than the other way around. They plant a tree each year by the river and call it Daniel's tree. It grows slow and stubborn, and in the spring, hums with a life that refuses to answer the world's open question. The disappearance remains unsolved. The watchers keep watching. Sometimes, in the long hours of the night when the air sits thick outside the bedroom window, you can hear Lila whispering names into the dark like a list of prayers. She says them slowly, one by one, until her voice becomes a kind of map. She's telling Daniel where to find them if the world still allows him to be found. She does it not in expectation, but to keep the ritual of calling his name. The ritual is all she has, a way to push back against the silence and remind the world that for some people, the story is far from over. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell so you stay updated with mystery stories that strike a chord. Thanks for watching.